Right now, in the dark waters of the Persian Gulf, the largest naval force assembled in years is converging on Iran. 2 American aircraft carriers, floating fortresses each carrying more firepower than most nations possess, are positioning themselves within striking distance of the Islamic Republic. This isn't a routine deployment. This isn't a symbolic show of force. President Trump has activated what he's calling a massive armada, and the message is crystal clear. Time is running out for Tehran. The question everyone from Washington to Tehran to Tel Aviv is asking isn't if something will happen, but when. The clock is ticking, and what unfolds in the coming weeks could reshape the entire Middle East for generations to come. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's most advanced aircraft carrier, received its orders and began steaming toward the Middle East from the Caribbean. This isn't just any warship. The Ford represents the pinnacle of American naval power, a vessel so technologically sophisticated that it cost over $13 billion to build. Its flight deck can accommodate more than 75 aircraft, and it's capable of launching 160 sorties every single day. That means 160 combat missions, day after day, without pause. To put that in perspective, that's more air power than most countries can muster in a month, and the Ford can deliver it daily. But the Ford isn't sailing alone. It's bringing an entire strike group, a collection of destroyers, cruisers, and submarines armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, each capable of hitting targets over 1,000 miles away with pinpoint accuracy. Now here's where this gets serious. The Ford is joining the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is already in the region with its own strike group. The Lincoln has been patrolling these waters, maintaining what the Pentagon calls presence operations, but that presence is about to double. 2 carrier strike groups operating in tandem represent an overwhelming concentration of military power. Together, these floating air bases carry approximately 150 advanced fighter jets, including F/A-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters. They're supported by an arsenal of missiles, both defensive and offensive, that can engage threats from the ocean floor to the edge of space. The combined firepower of these 2 strike groups exceeds the entire military capability of many nations. The technological sophistication of these vessels is staggering. The Ford-class carriers use electromagnetic aircraft launch systems instead of traditional steam catapults, allowing for more aircraft launches with less maintenance. They have advanced radar systems that can track hundreds of targets simultaneously. Their nuclear reactors provide virtually unlimited range and can power the ship for over 20 years without refueling. But why now? Why this massive buildup? The answer lies in a high-stakes gamble that Trump is making, a strategy that combines crushing military pressure with diplomatic negotiations in a race against time. Trump has set a deadline. He wants a nuclear deal with Iran finalized by next month. Not next year, not in 6 months, but in a matter of weeks. This is the kind of timeline that makes diplomats nervous and military planners work around the clock. The president has been explicit about what happens if Iran doesn't come to the table with a deal he finds acceptable. He's used words like traumatic and warned it would be a bad day for Iran. These aren't casual remarks. When a president deploys 2 aircraft carriers and uses language like that, the world pays attention. The deployment order itself represents a massive logistical undertaking. Thousands of personnel had to be mobilized, supplies loaded, maintenance accelerated, and families notified that their loved ones were heading into what could become a combat zone. The context here is crucial. Just last week, indirect talks between the United States and Iran took place in Oman. These were the first negotiations since June, and June was when everything changed. That month saw a 12-day conflict that Pentagon officials codenamed Operation Midnight Hammer. American forces joined Israel in striking 3 Iranian nuclear sites. For 12 days, the region held its breath as bombs fell on Iranian nuclear facilities. The operation achieved its tactical objectives, damaging Iran's nuclear infrastructure. But it didn't eliminate the program. It set it back, bought time, but didn't end the threat. Now, 8 months later, that window is closing. Intelligence assessments suggest Iran has been rebuilding, reconstituting its nuclear program in hardened facilities, some buried deep underground, some disguised within civilian infrastructure. Satellite imagery has shown increased activity at known nuclear sites, with new construction visible and convoys of trucks moving materials under cover of darkness. Iran's position in these negotiations has been remarkably consistent. President Pezeshkian, who has been navigating an impossible situation domestically, has stated that Iran is not seeking nuclear weapons and is willing to allow verification. On the surface, that sounds like a potential breakthrough. But there's a massive complication. Iran has categorically ruled out discussing its ballistic missile program. This is non-negotiable for Tehran. The ballistic missiles represent Iran's primary conventional deterrent, the weapons that allow it to project power across the region, to threaten American bases, to reach Israel, to hold the Gulf states at risk. Iran has invested billions of dollars over decades developing these missile capabilities. They possess short-range tactical missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles, and are reportedly working on intercontinental ballistic missile technology. These weapons have been tested repeatedly, sometimes successfully, sometimes ending in spectacular failures that are captured by satellite imagery and analyzed by intelligence agencies worldwide. For Iran's leadership, giving up these missiles would be strategic suicide. They remember what happened to Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who gave up his weapons programs and was later overthrown with NATO assistance. They watched Saddam Hussein's Iraq get invaded despite having no nuclear weapons. The lesson Iran's leadership has drawn is that only genuine deterrent capability ensures survival. But for the United States, and especially for Israel, any deal that leaves Iran's missile arsenal intact is fundamentally inadequate. Israel has faced rocket attacks from Iranian proxies for years. Hezbollah in Lebanon possesses an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles, many supplied by Iran. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have fired thousands of rockets at Israeli cities. The idea of Iran itself, with its much larger arsenal and longer-range missiles, remaining fully armed is unacceptable to Israeli security planners. And that brings us to Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli Prime Minister met with Trump recently, and according to multiple sources, they made a joint decision to continue applying maximum pressure on Iran while negotiations proceed. Netanyahu isn't just a bystander in this drama. Israel has its own profound concerns about Iran's nuclear ambitions and has made clear it will act unilaterally if necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Israel has conducted covert operations inside Iran for years, assassinating nuclear scientists, sabotaging equipment, launching cyber attacks like the famous Stuxnet virus that destroyed centrifuges. Israeli intelligence agencies maintain networks inside Iran, recruiting sources, gathering information, preparing for potential military strikes. But Netanyahu's involvement adds another layer of complexity to the current crisis. Middle East analysts, including Moan Rabbani, a respected expert on the region, have suggested that Netanyahu is deliberately trying to sabotage any potential deal by insisting on poison pill provisions that Iran will never accept. Specifically, Netanyahu is pushing hard for any agreement to include Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. He knows Iran won't agree to that, and that's exactly the point. If negotiations fail, it provides justification for more aggressive action. Netanyahu has his own domestic political considerations. He faces ongoing legal challenges and corruption charges in Israel. A major foreign policy crisis or military operation can shift public attention and rally support around the leadership. He's also ideologically committed to preventing Iranian regional dominance and sees this moment as potentially historic, a chance to fundamentally weaken or even eliminate the Iranian threat. His relationship with Trump gives him significant influence over American policy in ways that previous Israeli prime ministers could only dream of. This is where the situation becomes genuinely dangerous. You have Trump wanting a deal quickly, driven by his desire for a signature foreign policy achievement and perhaps influenced by intelligence assessments about Iran's nuclear timeline. You have Iran willing to negotiate on nuclear issues, but absolutely refusing any discussion of missiles or regional activities, seeing these as matters of sovereign national security that no external power has the right to dictate. The Ford will take 3 to 4 weeks to arrive from its current position. The timeline is important because it means the full military capability won't be in place immediately. The carrier must transit thousands of miles of ocean, navigating through various choke points, coordinating with other vessels in the strike group, and maintaining operational security so that potential adversaries can't track its exact position and movements. But it also means there's a window for diplomacy, a period where negotiations can continue while the implicit threat grows day by day as the Ford steams closer. Every day that passes, every nautical mile covered, increases the pressure on Tehran. Leadership can see the satellite imagery just as well as anyone else. They know exactly where these carriers are and when they'll arrive in the region. The psychological impact of this approaching deadline cannot be overstated. What would military action actually look like if diplomacy fails? Reuters has reported, citing unnamed American officials, that the military is preparing contingency plans for a weeks-long operation against Iran. This wouldn't be a one-night strike like the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, or even a short campaign like the initial phase of the 2003 Iraq invasion. We're talking about a sustained campaign targeting nuclear facilities, missile sites, command and control centers, air defense systems, naval bases, and potentially Iran's Navy and Air Force to establish air superiority and maritime dominance. The operation would likely begin with waves of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from submarines and surface ships, hitting radar installations and air defense batteries to blind Iran's military and create corridors for manned aircraft. The 2 carrier strike groups would launch waves of aircraft around the clock. F-35C stealth fighters would penetrate Iranian air defenses to hit the most heavily defended sites, using their stealth characteristics to avoid detection until weapons release. FA-18 Super Hornets would conduct the bulk of strike missions against known targets. EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft would jam Iranian radars and communications. E-2D Hawkeye command and control aircraft would coordinate the air campaign and provide early warning of any Iranian aerial response. Meanwhile, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, flying from bases thousands of miles away, possibly as far as Missouri or Diego Garcia, would drop massive bunker-busting bombs on underground facilities. These massive ordnance penetrators weigh 30,000 pounds each and are specifically designed to destroy deeply buried targets. They can penetrate hundreds of feet of concrete and earth before detonating. This would be the largest American military operation since Iraq in 2003, and unlike Iraq, Iran has significant capabilities to fight back. This is not a militarily weak country that would simply absorb attacks without response. Iran isn't defenseless. It has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, building up asymmetric warfare capabilities specifically designed to counter American military superiority. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has developed tactics and weapons meant to exploit vulnerabilities in the American way of war. Iran can unleash swarms of fast attack boats against naval vessels in the narrow confines of the Strait of Hormuz. These small, highly maneuverable boats armed with rockets, torpedoes, and even explosive charges for suicide attacks could potentially overwhelm the defensive systems of larger warships through sheer numbers. While American ships would destroy many of these boats in the confined waters of the strait, some could get through. Iran possesses anti-ship cruise missiles, including advanced Russian and Chinese designs, as well as domestically produced variants. These weapons have been tested in exercises and have demonstrated accuracy against naval targets. Iran also claims to have hypersonic missile technology, weapons that travel at speeds exceeding Mach 5 and maneuver during flight, making them extremely difficult to intercept with current missile defense systems. Whether these claims are genuine or exaggerated remains debated among intelligence analysts, but the possibility cannot be dismissed. A hypersonic anti-ship missile hitting an American aircraft carrier would be catastrophic, potentially causing thousands of casualties, and dealing a blow to American prestige and power projection capability that would resonate globally. Iran's proxy forces across the region represent another dimension of potential retaliation. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with its massive rocket arsenal, could launch sustained attacks against northern Israel, forcing millions of Israelis into bomb shelters and potentially overwhelming the Iron Dome missile defense system through saturation attacks. Various militia groups in Iraq, many of which receive funding, training, and weapons from Iran, could attack American diplomatic facilities and military bases. Similar groups in Syria could target American positions there. Houthi forces in Yemen, already engaged in attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, could intensify those operations. Iran has demonstrated its ability to strike with precision, as it did when it hit Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Khurais in September 2019 with drones and missiles. Those attacks, conducted with remarkable accuracy, temporarily knocked out roughly half of Saudi Arabia's oil production and sent shockwaves through global energy markets. Most critically, Iran could shut down or severely disrupt traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which about 20% of the world's oil supply flows daily. The strait, at its narrowest point, is only 21 miles wide. Iran controls the northern shore and has fortified positions overlooking the shipping lanes. Mining the strait, sinking ships to block the channel, or simply threatening shipping with missiles and fast attack boats could close this crucial choke point. Even a temporary closure would send global oil prices skyrocketing, potentially above $200 per barrel. That would trigger inflation worldwide, strain economies already dealing with various challenges, potentially provoke an economic crisis. The global economy is interconnected in ways that make regional conflicts have worldwide consequences almost immediately. The Gulf Arab states are watching all of this with deep anxiety. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman all have American military presence on their soil. They host bases, they've purchased billions in American weapons, and they share concerns about Iranian regional ambitions and support for Shia militant groups that could threaten Sunni-led governments. But they've also warned publicly that any attack on Iran could escalate into another devastating regional conflict that would not respect borders or distinguish between participants and bystanders. These countries remember the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq war that killed over 1 million people and saw cities bombed, chemical weapons used, and tanker attacks in the Gulf that drew in international naval forces. They remember how the 2003 Iraq invasion, launched with promises of quick victory and democratic transformation, instead destabilized the entire region for a generation. They've watched Syria tear itself apart in a civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands and created millions of refugees. They don't want their countries to become battlefields, and they definitely don't want their oil infrastructure becoming targets for Iranian retaliation. These facilities represent not just economic assets, but the very foundation of these states' wealth and stability. A sustained campaign of attacks against Gulf oil infrastructure could cripple these economies and create political instability that could threaten the ruling families. Some of these states have actually been working to reduce tensions with Iran in recent years, pursuing diplomatic engagement and economic cooperation, seeing détente as a better path than confrontation. Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations in 2023 after years of hostility, a rapprochement mediated by China that surprised many observers. The UAE has maintained commercial ties with Iran even during periods of heightened tension. These countries are trapped between their alliance with America and their need to coexist geographically with Iran in perpetuity. Adding another volatile element to this already explosive mixture is Iran's internal situation. The country is in the deepest crisis since the 1979 revolution. Protests erupted on December 28, 2025, initially triggered by a currency collapse that saw the rial lose half its value in a matter of weeks, and persistent hyperinflation that has destroyed ordinary Iranians' savings and purchasing power. People who worked their entire lives found their pensions worthless. The middle class has been decimated. Basic goods have become unaffordable for millions. But the protests quickly evolved into something much larger and more threatening to the regime, with demonstrators calling for fundamental political change, for an end to the Islamic Republic system itself, for democracy and freedom. The slogans chanted in the streets have been revolutionary, directly challenging the legitimacy of the supreme leader and the entire clerical establishment. The government's response has been brutal and uncompromising. The US-based human rights activist news agency, which has sources inside Iran and has proven reliable in past reporting, reports that nearly 7,000 people have been killed in the crackdown. Even Iran's own official figures, which almost certainly undercount the real toll and exclude many deaths that occurred in custody or from injuries sustained during protests, put the death toll at over 3,000. This is an unprecedented level of violence against protesters in Iran's modern history. Previous protest movements in 2009 and 2019 saw casualties in the dozens or low hundreds. This is an order of magnitude greater. The regime is clearly frightened, using lethal force to suppress dissent, deploying security forces with orders to shoot protesters, arresting thousands, and holding them in overcrowded prisons, where reports of torture and abuse are common. Internet access has been cut or severely restricted in many areas, making it difficult for protesters to organize or for information to reach the outside world. The regime has labeled protesters as foreign agents and terrorists, using the same rhetoric it applies to external enemies. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has taken the lead in suppressing the unrest, viewing it as an existential threat to the system they are sworn to protect. But despite the violence, protests have continued in various cities, suggesting a level of popular anger and desperation that cannot be easily suppressed. People are willing to risk death to demand change, which tells you everything about how bad conditions have become for ordinary Iranians. This internal instability makes the external pressure even more dangerous and unpredictable. Trump has openly stated that regime change is the best thing that could happen in Iran. That's an extraordinary statement for an American president to make, essentially calling for the overthrow of another country's government. IT signals that Trump sees this not just as a nuclear issue or a regional security problem, but as an opportunity for fundamental transformation of Iran's political system. From Trump's perspective, a weak and unstable Iranian government might be more willing to make concessions, more desperate to avoid military action that could be the final blow to its legitimacy and perhaps trigger its collapse. The thinking is that the regime, facing both internal revolt and external military threat, might conclude that a bad deal is better than destruction. But from Iran's perspective, this rhetoric and strategy make compromise even harder and perhaps impossible. If the regime believes that America's ultimate goal is its destruction, that any deal would simply be a prelude to further pressure and eventual overthrow, then why make any concessions at all? Why not double down on resistance, accelerate the nuclear program as quickly as possible, and try to achieve a genuine deterrent capability before it's too late? The North Korean model becomes attractive. Acquire nuclear weapons as quickly as possible, weather the sanctions in isolation, and then negotiate from a position of strength with the ultimate deterrent in hand. Iran's leadership has studied what happened to countries that gave up their weapons programs, and the lessons they've drawn do not encourage compromise. The nuclear issue itself deserves deeper examination because it sits at the heart of this entire crisis. What exactly is Iran's nuclear program, and how close is it to producing a weapon? After the Operation Midnight Hammer strikes in June, Iran's program suffered significant damage. Centrifuges, the machines that spin uranium hexafluoride gas at high speeds to separate isotopes and produce enriched uranium, were destroyed. Facilities were damaged by bunker-busting bombs and precision strikes. Materials may have been contaminated or lost. Scientists were killed or injured. For a few months, the program was genuinely set back. But nuclear programs are remarkably resilient, more so than many people realize. The fundamental knowledge doesn't disappear, The scientists who survived retain their expertise and can train new personnel. Equipment can be rebuilt or replaced, either through domestic production or covert procurement from countries willing to supply dual-use technology despite international sanctions. Intelligence assessments, based on satellite imagery, signals intelligence, human sources inside Iran's nuclear program, and analysis of procurement patterns, suggest Iran has been working aggressively to recover from the June strikes. New centrifuges have been installed at known facilities. Work has accelerated at underground sites like Fordo, buried deep in a mountain and hardened against attack. There are indications that Iran may be dispersing its program, spreading activities across multiple smaller facilities, rather than concentrating them in a few large sites, making it much harder for any military strike to eliminate the entire program. Some facilities may be hidden within civilian industrial sites, making targeting them politically and operationally more difficult due to potential civilian casualties. Current estimates suggest Iran could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single nuclear device in a matter of months, perhaps as little as a few weeks, if it made the political decision to do so and dedicated all its resources to that goal. That's the breakout time, the period between deciding to build a bomb and having sufficient fissile material. Iran currently enriches uranium to various levels for claimed civilian purposes, including 60% enrichment ostensibly for research reactor fuel. Weapons-grade uranium is typically 90% enriched. The technical jump from 60% to 90% is relatively small compared to the jump from natural uranium to 60%. Much of the hard work has already been done. The actual weaponization process, turning that material into a deliverable warhead that can survive the stress of being launched on a missile, withstand the heat of re-entry, and detonate with predictable yield, would take longer, perhaps a year or more. But once a country crosses the threshold of possessing weapons-grade material, the rest becomes almost inevitable, given time and resources. This is why the timeline matters so much, why Trump is pushing for a deal within a month. That's not an arbitrary deadline pulled from thin air. Intelligence assessments likely inform him that Iran's nuclear program is approaching, or may have already reached a critical point where further delay becomes increasingly risky. Every month that passes, without either a diplomatic agreement or military action, brings Iran closer to a nuclear capability. Once Iran achieves a genuine nuclear weapons capability, the entire strategic calculation changes dramatically. The threat of military action becomes far less credible because the risks become exponentially higher. Nobody wants to start a war with a nuclear-armed opponent, or even an opponent on the verge of nuclear capability who might use weapons in desperation. The window for preventive military action exists only while Iran remains non-nuclear. Once that changes, the options narrow to containment and deterrence, strategies that America and Israel have been reluctant to accept. So there's a window, probably a narrow and rapidly closing one, where military action remains a viable option if diplomacy fails, and that window is measured in weeks or months, not years. This creates enormous pressure on all parties to make decisions quickly, which is exactly when mistakes are most likely to happen. The negotiations themselves are extraordinarily complex, involving issues that nations have spent years debating. What would an acceptable deal actually look like to all parties? From the American and Israeli perspective, it would need to include severely intrusive inspections with access to any site on demand, including military facilities where Iran claims inspections would compromise national security. It would require severe limits on uranium enrichment levels and quantities, restricting Iran to enrichment necessary for civilian power generation only. IT would mandate restrictions on advanced centrifuges, limiting Iran to older, less efficient models. It would demand answers to outstanding questions about past weapons research that Iran has never fully addressed. And ideally, from the American and Israeli view, it would include some constraints on missiles and regional activities, limits on Iran's ballistic missile development and testing, reductions in support for proxy forces, and changes in Iranian regional behavior that Washington and Tel Aviv find threatening. From Iran's perspective, none of that is acceptable in its totality. Iran wants immediate removal of all economic sanctions, not phased relief tied to compliance, but immediate restoration of normal trade and financial relations. Iran wants guarantees that America won't withdraw from any agreement again, as Trump did with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In 2018, it's unclear what guarantees could possibly be sufficient, given America's political system, where treaties can be abandoned by new administrations. Iran wants explicit recognition of its right to peaceful nuclear energy, including domestic enrichment, seeing this as a matter of national sovereignty and technological achievement. And Iran wants absolutely no discussion of missiles or regional policies, viewing these as internal matters of national defense that no external power has the right to dictate. The ballistic missile program is seen as essential deterrence. The support for regional groups like Hezbollah and others is viewed as strategic depth and ideological commitment. These are red lines that Iran's leadership, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which controls much of the missile program and regional activities, will not cross. The gap between these positions is enormous, a chasm that cannot be bridged in weeks, without one or both sides making concessions they've said are impossible. The previous nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was negotiated under President Obama and involved not just the United States and Iran, but also Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China, took years of intensive negotiations to complete. It involved hundreds of technical experts debating the details of centrifuge numbers, enrichment levels, inspection protocols, and sanctions relief schedules. The final agreement ran to over 100 pages of text and technical annexes. It was hardly perfect, criticized by hawks as too lenient and by doves as too restrictive, but it did accomplish something tangible. It froze Iran's nuclear program at existing levels, rolled back some capabilities, and established a comprehensive verification regime with International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors having regular access to Iranian facilities. For several years, Iran was in compliance with the agreement's terms according to international inspectors. Then, Trump withdrew from that deal in May 2018, calling it the worst agreement ever negotiated, criticizing it for having sunset clauses that would eventually allow Iran more nuclear freedom, for not covering missiles or regional activities, and for providing sanctions relief that funded Iranian malign activities. Trump imposed a maximum pressure sanctions campaign designed to bring Iran to its knees economically and force it to either collapse or come to the negotiating table for a better deal that addressed all American concerns. The result has been 6 years of escalating tensions, several near-war incidents, including the downing of an American surveillance drone, tit-for-tat attacks on shipping and oil facilities, the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by an American drone strike, Iranian missile attacks on American bases in Iraq, and Iran's nuclear program actually advancing well beyond where it was under the original deal, both in quantities of enriched uranium and in enrichment levels. Now Trump wants to negotiate a new agreement in weeks, compressing a process that previously took years into a time frame that diplomats consider almost impossible. The compression of this timeline virtually guarantees that any deal will be incomplete, probably controversial, criticized from all sides, and potentially unstable. But the alternative might be war, which focuses the mind remarkably. What are the possible outcomes here in the coming weeks? Let's walk through the scenarios because understanding the range of possibilities is crucial to grasping at just how high the stakes are. Best case scenario, Iran and the United States somehow find common ground on core nuclear issues through intense negotiations mediated by Oman or another intermediary. An agreement gets signed that freezes or rolls back Iran's program in exchange for sanctions relief. The exact details would be debated, but the fundamental trade-off would be Iranian nuclear restraint for economic normalization. The missiles and regional issues get set aside for future discussions or simply ignored. Netanyahu objects loudly, but ultimately doesn't veto the deal. The carriers eventually sail away, crisis averted, and the region steps back from the brink. This would be hailed as a major diplomatic achievement, though critics would immediately attack it as insufficient or dangerous. This scenario seems increasingly unlikely given the positions of all parties, the short timeline, and Netanyahu's influence, but it remains technically possible until it definitively isn't. Diplomacy can sometimes produce surprises when the alternative is war that nobody really wants. Second scenario, negotiations continue past Trump's deadline without producing agreement. The carriers remain deployed, maintaining pressure, the rhetoric stays heated, but nobody actually pulls the trigger. The situation enters an uncertain holding pattern where everyone is armed and on edge, but nobody initiates hostilities. This state of affairs could persist for weeks or even months, a dangerous equilibrium where military forces face each other, where a miscalculation or accident could trigger escalation, but where the fundamental calculation that war is worse than continued standoff keeps preventing actual conflict. This scenario has historical precedent in various Cold War confrontations where tensions ran high but restraint prevailed. However, it is inherently unstable because maintaining such a high state of military readiness is expensive, exhausting, and cannot continue indefinitely without either resolution or escalation. Third scenario, negotiations collapse or produce proposals that Iran refuses to accept, or Iran demands conditions that America and Israel refuse to accept. Trump, either because he genuinely believes military action is necessary or because he feels politically committed to his deadline and threats, order strikes. These could be limited, hitting specific nuclear facilities with the goal of setting back the program for years, or they could be more extensive, a broader campaign targeting not just nuclear sites, but also missile facilities, command centers, and military capabilities. Iran retaliates using the various means at its disposal, attacking American forces, striking at Gulf Arab states, closing or mining the Strait of Hormuz, unleashing proxy forces against Israel and American positions throughout the region. American forces respond to those attacks, and the region descends into a multi-week conflict with unpredictable consequences and escalation dynamics that nobody can fully control. Oil prices spike, global markets react, and the Middle East enters another period of warfare. Fourth scenario, and perhaps the most concerning because it's the least controlled, something happens that nobody planned for, an incident that triggers escalation regardless of anyone's intentions. An Iranian fast attack boat squadron conducting aggressive maneuvers gets too close to American warships in the Strait of Hormuz, and American sailors, operating under rules of engagement that authorize defensive measures, perceive an imminent threat and open fire. Multiple boats are destroyed, Iranian sailors killed, and Tehran faces a choice between accepting that humiliation or responding with force. Or an Iranian missile test, something that Iran conducts periodically, goes wrong, and the missile hits something it wasn't supposed to, perhaps a commercial vessel or even an American warship. Or a proxy group, acting with or without direct Iranian orders, launches an attack that kills American or Israeli personnel, creating pressure for retaliation. Any of these incidents, or dozens of others you could imagine in a region where armed forces face each other in close proximity, could spiral into a larger confrontation that nobody actually wanted. The historical parallels here are concerning and worth examining because history, while it doesn't repeat exactly, often echoes. In the summer of 1914, European powers found themselves in a crisis over the assassination of an Austrian archduke. It seemed like a regional issue, another Balkan crisis in a region that had produced many crises before. Nobody among the major powers really wanted a continental war. Leaders believed their military mobilizations and shows of force were just diplomatic pressure, signals of resolve meant to back up their respective allies and deter their opponents. But the mechanisms of alliance commitments, military timetables that once started, couldn't easily be stopped, and nationalist pressures took over. Within weeks, Europe was at war. World War I, the war that leaders assured their populations would be over by Christmas, killed millions and destroyed empires. While that specific scenario seems unlikely today, the basic dynamics of escalation driven by military deployments, fear of being caught unprepared, miscalculation, and domestic political pressures is absolutely present in the current situation. Consider the domestic political contexts driving each leader because these aren't abstract strategic decisions, divorced from political reality. Trump is in his second term, potentially thinking about his legacy and how history will remember his presidency. He wants a dramatic foreign policy achievement, something that demonstrates American power and his personal deal-making skills. He's also facing political opposition that will criticize him regardless of what he does, either as too weak and appeasing if he doesn't take firm action against Iran, or as recklessly starting unnecessary wars if he does use military force. His political base expects him to be tough on Iran, a position he's held consistently for years. But a major war could also turn that base against him if American casualties mount, or if the economic consequences prove severe. He's threading a needle, trying to appear strong while hopefully achieving a deal that avoids war. Iran's leadership faces perhaps the most acute domestic pressures. They're dealing with the most serious challenge to the regime since the 1979 revolution. Thousands are dead in the streets. The economy is in free fall. The legitimacy of the entire Islamic Republic system is being questioned openly by protesters who no longer fear arrest or death. The Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guard need to appear strong and uncompromising to their hardline base, to prove that the revolution has not weakened or betrayed its principles. They cannot be seen as capitulating to American pressure or accepting humiliating terms, because that would further weaken their position domestically at precisely the moment when they're fighting for survival. Yet they also cannot afford a war that would likely devastate what remains of Iran's economy and potentially provide the catalyst for regime collapse. It's an impossible position with no good options, only degrees of terrible outcomes to choose from. Netanyahu faces his own domestic political pressures and legal challenges in Israel that shape his decision-making in ways that might not align with broader strategic interests. He's been in and out of power for years, currently serving while facing corruption charges that could potentially send him to prison if he loses office and legal immunity. A major confrontation with Iran, Israel's primary strategic threat, could distract from those legal issues while cementing his legacy as the leader who finally dealt with the Iranian nuclear program after warning about it for decades. He's also ideologically committed to preventing Iranian nuclear capability and regional dominance, genuinely believing that Iran represents an existential threat to Israel that must be eliminated, or at minimum, severely weakened. His relationship with Trump, built over years and strengthened during Trump's first term when the administration recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the embassy there, gives him unprecedented influence over American policy. None of these leaders can easily back down without paying significant political costs, which makes compromise extremely difficult and conflict more likely than it would be if they were operating in different political environments. The international community's role adds yet another dimension to this already complex situation. European nations, led by France, Germany, and Britain, all have interests in preventing a US-Iran war. Europe relies heavily on Middle Eastern energy, despite diversification efforts. A major conflict would send oil and gas prices soaring, hitting European economies that are already struggling with various challenges. Europe also fears the potential refugee flows that a major Middle Eastern war could generate, adding to migration pressures that have created political tensions across the continent. European leaders have called for restraint and offered to mediate, but their actual influence over American decision-making is limited, especially under an administration that has shown skepticism of traditional alliances and multilateral approaches. Russia has relationships with Iran and sees American power projection in the Middle East as threatening to its own interests. Russia provides weapons to Iran, has coordinated with Iran in Syria, and views Iran as a counterweight to American dominance in the region. A successful American military operation that weakens or overthrows the Iranian regime would strengthen America's position at Russia's expense. China is Iran's largest trading partner, buying Iranian oil despite sanctions, and doesn't want disruption to energy markets or another demonstration of American military success. China has broader strategic concerns about American power and sees Iran as part of a coalition of states resisting American hegemony, but none of these powers, despite their interests in preventing war, have sufficient leverage to compel either Washington or Tehran to make the concessions necessary for peace. The United Nations Security Council is paralyzed by divisions between the permanent members who have veto power. Russia and China would likely veto any resolution authorizing military action against Iran, while they lack the votes to pass a resolution constraining American action. International law and norms, which theoretically constrain the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization, are routinely ignored when major powers decide their security interests require action, as has been demonstrated repeatedly over the past several decades. So while many voices internationally call for restraint and diplomacy, the actual ability to enforce that restraint is minimal. The international system that emerged after World War II was designed to prevent exactly these kinds of conflicts, but it has proven unable to consistently do so when powerful states decide otherwise. Meanwhile, those two aircraft carriers keep moving closer with every hour that passes. Sailors aboard the Ford and the Lincoln are going through their daily routines, maintaining the aircraft, standing watches, training for missions they may or may not have to fly. Most of them probably don't fully grasp the geopolitical complexities that brought them to these waters. They're professionals doing their jobs, following orders, trusting that their leaders are making wise decisions. But their actions in a crisis moment, their professionalism and training, could help determine whether this ends in diplomacy or war. The pilots who would fly strike missions into Iranian airspace, knowing that some of them might not return if Iran's air defenses get lucky shots. The submarine crews who would launch Tomahawks toward Iranian targets, understanding that they're initiating acts of war. The intelligence specialists monitoring Iranian communications, listening for signs of mobilization or attack preparations, trying to provide warning of Iranian intentions. All of them are preparing for possibilities they sincerely hope won't materialize. The coming weeks will be absolutely decisive for the future of the Middle East and potentially beyond. Trump's deadline is approaching with the inexorability of a countdown clock. The Ford is steaming steadily toward the Gulf, covering hundreds of miles per day on its journey from the Caribbean through the Atlantic, probably transiting the Suez Canal to enter the Red Sea and then the Gulf of Aden before reaching the Arabian Sea and finally the Persian Gulf itself. Negotiations are ongoing, but the positions remain far apart, perhaps unbridgeably so. Iran's government is trying desperately to manage internal unrest while facing external threats, a two-front political war that few governments could survive long-term. Netanyahu is pushing his agenda with all the influence and pressure he can bring to bear. The Gulf Arab states are nervously watching, trying to prepare for potential conflict while hoping it doesn't come. And underneath all the military posturing and diplomatic maneuvering is a fundamental question that nobody has definitively answered and perhaps cannot answer until events actually unfold. Can this situation be resolved peacefully through negotiations and compromise? Or are we witnessing the final countdown to the next major Middle Eastern war? The concentration of military power in the region, the rigid political positions held by leaders who face severe constraints on their ability to compromise, the domestic pressures on all sides that push toward confrontation rather than accommodation, and the long history of miscalculation and unintended escalation in this region all suggest that we're closer to major conflict than at any point since the 2003 Iraq invasion. But until the moment bombs actually fall or an agreement gets signed and implemented, both outcomes remain possible. This is precisely what makes the current moment so uniquely dangerous and so critically important. What happens in the Persian Gulf in the coming weeks won't just affect Iran and America, though those two nations obviously have the most at stake. IT will shape global energy markets and oil prices, affecting economies worldwide and potentially triggering recession if oil spikes high enough for long enough. It will influence great power relationships, demonstrating whether American military power can still achieve its objectives or whether resistance can successfully deter the world's strongest military. It will determine the future of nuclear non-proliferation efforts, either demonstrating that the international community can prevent determined proliferation or showing that patient pursuit of nuclear weapons can eventually succeed despite opposition. And it could potentially redraw the Middle East's political map if the Iranian regime collapses under the combined pressure of internal revolt and external attack, creating a vacuum that various forces would rush to fill. 2 aircraft carriers are converging on Iran at this very moment. Diplomats are frantically negotiating in various capitals, and through various intermediaries, military planners are updating contingency plans and running through scenarios. And the world is holding its breath, waiting to see whether this ends with signatures on a treaty or missiles flying through the night sky toward their targets. The countdown is genuinely on, the clock is ticking toward Trump's deadline, and time is running out for everyone involved. The decisions made in the next few weeks will echo for years or decades to come. This is history being made in real time, and none of us can yet know how this chapter ends.